Well, good evening, everybody. Welcome to all of you, wherever you are, however you are situated in your place and how you're accessing this. We welcome you to tonight's McMaster Philosophy Talks. We are indeed out of the ivory tower and on the airwaves, and happy to be engaging in philosophical investigation with all of you. And we do really mean that. With all of you, you are welcome to provide your questions. We will do our best. I will do my best to look through those questions and see if we can pose them to our two panelists with us here today as we discuss the topic of tonight's talk, reckoning with racism. Now, of course, this is a very timely topic, but of course, it is also not only current. This has certainly been going on. And so when we think about racism, certainly it is located in prejudicial beliefs, in discriminatory or antagonistic practices of some against others on the basis of race or ethnicity. And it goes without saying that the ravages of racism are myriad. Genocide, slavery, the Indian Act, Jim Crow, apartheid, residential schooling, redlining, voter suppression, police brutality, separate but equal, social inequities. Racism is multiform. It's as overt as the hurling of an epithet, or as subtle as the way a racialized other is represented in the dominant media. It can be an ideological commitment made manifest in a program of research and writing, and it can also be institutionalized in the educational system, obtaining its curriculum on the basis of such ideology. It can be present in the framing of a law or in the enforcement of one or both. It can also be either intentional or unconscious, malicious or indifferent, systematic or disorganized. It is both historical and contemporary in scope, both global and local in scale. For some, it's thought to no longer be present. For others, it's never absent. For some, it's the topic of greatest concern, and for others, of great discomfort. So given this conceptual complexity and the complexity of the reality of something that is perhaps not even ontologically real, there are any number of investigations that we could make into the concept of racism, the reality of racism. Today, we want to focus on the historical and systemic aspects of racism. And in doing so, we want to focus on basically three problems or three questions. The problem of recognition, the problem of responsibility, and the problem of restoration, to help us get some clarity and to make this investigation so whereby we can think more deeply, reflect more deeply, think more critically and creatively about this. I am joined by Dr. Brad Stone of Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles. He is professor and graduate director in the Department of Philosophy there, and is a professor and department chair in African American Studies. I am also joined by Dr. Bonny Ibhawoh of McMaster University. He is professor in the departments of both history and peace studies, Senator William McMaster Chair in Global Human Rights, and the director for the Center for Human Rights and Restorative Justice. So both of you, I welcome you and thank you for your willingness to act as panelists for tonight's discussion. So straight off, let's get into this first problem of recognition. There is the repression of the expression of the truth about historical institutional racism, but there's also the potential for resistance to recognizing this truth when it is expressed. I want to share two quotes from James Baldwin that I think puts this problem into focus. The first is from a 1965 essay called The White Man's Guilt. In it, Baldwin implores us that, quote, "The record is there for all to read. It resounds all over the world. It might as well be written in the sky. One wishes that Americans, and we could say those who are in Europe or Europe's former colonies, white Americans, would read for their own sakes this record and stop defending themselves against it. Only then will they be enabled to change their lives. The fact that they have not been able to do this, to face their history, to change their lives, hideously menaces this country. Indeed, it menaces the entire world. White man, hear me. History is not something to be read, and it does not refer merely to the past. On the contrary, the great force of history comes from the fact that we carry it within us, are unconsciously controlled by it in many ways, and history is literally present in all that we do." End quote. The second quote comes 20 years later from James Baldwin, who in the essay, The Price of the Ticket, is more despairing. And he says the following, quote, "A Black person in this democracy is certain to endure the unspeakable and the unimaginable. White Americans cannot, in the generality, hear this any more than their European ancestors and contemporaries could or can. I'm really saying something very simple. The will of the people or the state is revealed in the state's institutions. There was not then, nor is there now, a single American institution which is not a racist institution. Yes, we have lived through avalanches of tokens and concessions, but white power remains white. And what it appears to surrender with the one hand, it obsessively clutches with the other," end quote. So there appears to be a divide between the truth realized by the historically oppressed, the racialized other, and the truth recognized by the historical oppressor. If the historical record of racial injustice is, as Baldwin says, veritably there for all to read as it continuously exists in contemporary institutions and systems, what are some of the barriers limiting the ability or willingness of some to see it? How can someone resistant to the truth of the institutional, systemic nature of racism come to recognize it? Brad?
Oh, thanks for having me tonight. And I'm actually going to start by, of course, praising you for the use of Baldwin, probably the greatest truth teller in the United States as it pertains to racism. But I'm going to answer your question actually through Josiah Royce, an American philosopher who wrote a lot on communities. And one of the things he highlighted that at the center of any particular community is a shared conception of history. So what do you do in an American context when you have a group of people who do not want to be in community with someone else? Well, one way to make sure that you're not in community with them is by making sure you don't have a shared history. Because when we have shared histories, we might have shared responsibilities, and we might have shared interest in the future. And so one way to make sure that we do not have shared futures is to prevent a shared past. And so definitely in the United States context, and Canadians can answer this, for themselves, but in the United States context, there's a deliberate effort to not have something like a unified United States history, that we could all just say, this is what happened here. And when you have almost every other group in the United States more than aware of what happened here, and one group that actually does know what happened here, but won't acknowledge it, that's where we see the problem. The problem really isn't that people are ignorant or if only they knew more. It's the actual deliberate effort to not know, what Charles Mills calls active ignorance. that we find ourselves in when we talk about racism in the United States. Since there is no desire for the story of America to be such that, for example, an African-American person could be a great American or an ideal American, one cannot have a shared history, or else certain people become heroes and certain people might become villains. But it's really not the worry. You know, sometimes you hear people say, well, white people are worried in America that they'll become the villains. It's actually not that. It's the worry about who could become heroes, who could become great Americans, who could be ideal Americans. And that might include non-white people if we had honesty about the historical record.
Thank you, Brad. Bonnie, please.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes,
I can. Thank you so much. Yeah. Well, thank you for organizing this, and thank you for inviting me. I'm looking forward to a really rich, interesting conversation. I particularly like the way you framed this, James. Recognition, responsibility, and restoration. Questions of race are difficult conversations. To be tagged a racist is an irredeemable slaw. And for so long, I think many societies have put off this conversation. And so having the conversation at all, as far as I'm concerned, is progress. What comes out of it is a different matter altogether. I want to come to the question of recognition from the perspective of what I currently do. So my current research focus on truth and reconciliation. These mechanisms that have been established around the world to deal with historical injustices and human rights violations. At the last count, there have been over 50 Truth and Reconciliation Commissions around the world. And in Canada, we recently had one dealing with the atrocities of the residential school system. In my study of truth commissions, I find that people fall into two camps. There are those who are enthusiastically, in support of this ideal of dealing with these deep-seated, historical injustices, whether they're racism or genocide or war. But on the other hand, there are those who really do not want to deal with this. I call them the let sleeping dog lie group. Those who think that excavating the truth, coming to terms with history, it's in itself problematic. And people come to this from two perspectives, and this is what I find really interesting. On the one hand, you have those who, let's call them those in the dominant groups that obviously have a stake in not having this history rehashed and dug up. It makes them uncomfortable. It makes society uncomfortable. That's the let sleeping dog lie group. But the interesting group that I find in the course of my studies of Truth and Reconciliation Commissions from South Africa to Canada to Chile to Morocco to Tunisia to Rwanda is that there is a different group that is not opposed to the idea of reconciliation in itself, but finds it inherently problematic when it is tethered to recognition or a failure of recognition. So I hear very often, how can you have reconciliation when we are not even agreed on what happened? When we are not even agreed on the truth? When we are not even agreed on recognition of the pain and the harm that has been done? So increasingly, there is a sense that recognition is fundamental to everything else. If we cannot have recognition, then there can be no basis for reconciliation. So increasingly, I hear people who say, you need to disentangle these two things. Think about a truth commission as very distinct from a reconciliation commission. The success of the one will determine if the second goes forward. All this business about truth and reconciliation muddies the water. And it goes back, James, to the point you made about recognition. Why is recognition so essential? Because it is the basis of everything else. As Brad just noted, if there's no recognition, then there's no basis for a conversation about a shared history or a shared experience. And that leads me to the second part of the question is, why is there so much disparity on the question of recognition? It's interesting, we say, is there racism? Does it still exist? Okay, racism exists, there are bad people, there are individual racists, but you will find many people who says, well, institutional racism simply does not exist. It's gone. We dealt with that in the 60s. We had a civil rights movement. The Confederate flag, what does it mean? Is it heritage? Is it history? Oh, it's heritage. It's all about heritage. It was never about slavery. And so why so much disparity on the fundamental question of recognizing the harm and the pain and the history? I bring it down to 4 points, and these are very loose categories. The first is invisibility. People do not see, and not seeing could mean many things. It could be what Brad has called active ignorance, others have called the deliberate refusal to know, but it's there. It does not exist, It's a figment of the imagination of the grievance seekers, of the perpetually offended, of those who would let go, so they do not see. So the other point is denial. The denial because it provokes us to rethink our place in history and society. And so what we do is that we deny the existence. We do not claim it doesn't exist. We just refuse to engage with it. And you can talk about this not just in relation to racism, you can talk about this in relation to so many other issues, gender issues, the Me Too movement, and so many systems of oppression that have endured over the years. The third is apathy. I don't care. I wasn't alive when these things happened. I bear no responsibility for it. It is not within my frame of reference, therefore it doesn't exist. So these, I think, all converge in some ways in that they work collectively to create problems about recognition, problems that are central to finding solutions to these difficult questions. And if I might add, these barriers that I have so articulated have really been the problems that have hindered the kinds of conversation that should have taken place over the years about questions of racism. Because it's only when we at least can agree on the parameters for recognition that we can move on to the next steps, which you clearly identified, the steps of responsibility, and the steps of restoration.
Thank you, Bonny. So I'm hearing from both you and Brad that it seems that perhaps this issue of recognition is less one about what is, as we in philosophy might say, is epistemically available to the understanding. That it is, as Baldwin says, it's there for everyone to read. The record is there, and yet from both of your responses, it seems to be more of an issue of the will, or there's an emotional blockage. I'm reminded of Soren Kierkegaard, the 19th century Danish philosopher, in his journal wrote, the conditio sine qua non of Christianity is acknowledgement of sin. Mm-hmm. So, and that is, the sort of idea of reveal thy wound, so that the physician may heal you, and that we are very resistant to that. So is this, so if there is doubt about, or there's this resistance to recognition, and it's an active ignorance. It's a willful, either in the form of apathy or in the form of outright denial, or in the form of, well, it's not something that is visible to me. Perhaps the position that I occupy is insensate to me. How is this racism? Is it open to doubt, or is doubt then just an effect of that privileged position that those of us who occupy it, well, one of the privileges is that we can do that. We can make that move of active denial, of active ignorance. Can we know the difference between whether someone is doubting, whether racism, the systematicity of racism is open to doubt, or whether it's someone is just expressing that because of the systematic nature of racism?
Well, one way to address that, James, is talk about systems, right?
Yeah.
Just in general. Someday, one of the truths that, is open for all to know is that kind of doubting of the existence of racism is a very part of the system of racism. And so when I talk about racism in a variety of settings, I always, someone in the audience will bring up I could actually doubt this. And I highlight that they're playing their role very well. Mm-hmm. That this too is part of the game, what we could call racism. And then when they catch themselves being a participant in the game and that their moves are now predictable. Mm-hmm. So I then will ask them, do you also believe the following things? And that I can show them everything deducible from their one sentence. They become to realize, oh, I'm simply the lieutenant, literally the lieutenant. I hold the place of that doubter. Now, I wouldn't call that privilege. Privilege is a set of benefits someone receives in virtue of a position. That is not a benefit. That's a detriment. And since that's a detriment, it can't be privilege. So a lot of times what we call white privilege is just misnamed. It's not privilege. It's epistemic vice. It's being philosophically muddled at best. It's not knowing oneself. And so as long as we're honest about these kinds of things, I am actually of the opinion that one could be a racist. Go with me here for a second. For the sake of this argument, I'm perfectly fine if somebody is a racist. The question is how predictable that role is. And so even if someone wants to make room for racism, do they know that that's itself a role inside of this bigger game of racism? And that's what they often don't know. They don't realize how predictable they are, how discursively predictable. My main area of work is in Michel Foucault. And so the discursive pattern there, discursive formation, is completely describable. We know that in the United States, for example, the majority of people who want to deny the impacts of slavery, for example, on African Americans in the United States are also the same people that want to deny that the Civil War was about slavery. But they also want to deny that the South lost the Civil War. They also still haven't accepted that the South lost the Civil War. There's a neat subset of that in recent events that believe that Trump did not lose the election. These are predictable. And when you show how well played their position is, that then sows the proper doubt, the doubt in whether I'm just saying the lines that this character is supposed to say in this American drama, or am I actually thinking? And of course, mere cognition is not thinking. Thinking puts us into question. thinking raises us to a level of responsibility. And so that's the way I deal with that. There's not an actual doubt there. And since there's no actual doubt there, this claim of ignorance is not ignorant at all. And it has an entire discursive pattern that the speaker learned to utter. In that regard, I always say, if you're going to be racist, be the best possible one. You know, in the sense that most people are actually just so poor at it that, at least in my role as a philosopher, I have to call out in a certain way. And for me, that's very key. So we use certain language like privilege as if we invent that term or have some concept about what we're doing when we claim it. And I'm always weary about the discursive moves made. And so what other beliefs go into those beliefs? So even if a well-meaning white liberal person says, well, I'm going to acknowledge my privilege, I immediately stop them on that. Do you think that it's good or beneficial to be white? It's a very important question, right? So this isn't merely, in America right now, everything's so politically polarized. This is not, are you Democrat or Republican, right? Both sides will have difficulty answering the question I just posed. Do you think it's good, just in itself, intrinsically good somehow and beneficial to be white? That thing that's only existed about 400 years. Remember, there were no white people prior to 1654. No one was white before that. Being white is an American phenomenon, ironically. Then it spread throughout the world in a weird way. So we have to become honest about the discursive games we play. So for me, the claim of ignorance or denial is just one more move of the game. How do we get people to see what the actual discursive game is? And that's some of what I would hope we're moving toward in this conversation and in all future conversations. We still want to, even particularly philosophers, want to pretend that everyone has the right to doubt something. True, but let's make sure they're doubting the actual things and not the discursive things. Doubt as a discursive move is not doubting.
Right. I mean, so that really connects with, I think, what Bonny was saying previously. So we're sort of disambiguating truth from honesty. So the truth is there as a non-discursive record, for us to see. But these discursive practices, these dissimulations that we can engage in, are dishonest. And as Bonny was saying, when distinguishing truth from reconciliation, first we need the truth, and that really is less an issue of epistemic doubt as it is about this playing a parlor game, really, and as you're saying, Brad. So Bonny, could you weigh in on this?
Yeah, I just fascinated by this discussion about epistemic doubt, and I want us to bring a little bit of nuance into this discussion about recognition and denial, and I'll take it from a very practical standpoint. Most of those who deny racism would recognize at a fundamental epistemic level that racial discrimination does happen and racists do exist. The history is unquestionable. There was slavery and it brought horrors. There was Jim Crow and all these other atrocities you've outlined here in Canada, the history of the residential school and the Indian Act. That a lot of denials would argue exist. Where I find the manufactured ambiguity it's on the question of, well, does it exist in the same way today? And the whole narrative that we've moved on, and that was in the past. And then a more virulent version of that is the argument that, well, in some ways, it's not so much a denial, it's a refusal to recognize it in the way that racialized group and equity-seeking group choose to recognize it. So in some ways, that is it. And I'm always fascinated by this classic line of argument. Well, that happened in the past, like I said before, and I wasn't invested in that, and I bear no responsibility, or I bear limited responsibility for that. And I think this goes back to Brad's point, what I would call selective amnesia. What we are quick to claim the moral victories of history. I mean, think about it. Everyone is quick to talk about the victories of the Second World War and how we were the victorious group. Here in Canada, kids are taught from as young as they can be about the victories of the Canadian troops in Vimy Ridge and how that great battle cemented Canadian identity. So we have no problems at all claiming the moral victories of history. What we have problems with is owning the moral failings of history and our society. And it's a complicated an almost dubious process of selective amnesia, in which we recognize that history has this burden, but we choose, we consciously cherry pick those aspects of the histories that have shaped our society, our world, and the inequities we see around us in a way that fits a particular narrative. So I think it's not just so much a blunt question of rejection or denial. It's more, a process of selective amnesia that all work. And I think this is the important point, that these are not all innocuous, harmless, processes, consciously, unconsciously. They all work to entrench a system of racism. And I think this would be one of the ways why you can begin to understand the saying that, well, we have racism, but we have no racists. There are no actual racists, but somehow there's racism in society. Because in many ways, that assumption about the burden of history and our responsibility for history and our responsibility for the moral feelings of our society and our history has been so muddled that it is easy for us to cherry pick it, whether it's in the educational system, whether it's popular culture, whether it's in the discourses of the cultural narrators. We are told every day about the glories of history that we rightfully own. And yet the system is such that it is easy for us to push back and reject those moral feelings that we also own as part of members of society.
Yeah, thank you, Bonnie. I'm just receiving a number of questions here from the participants. One of them is from Emily, who asks, how do you go about reframing someone's racism or this denial, this game playing, to place it within the system in a way that they will recognize it?
Well, usually, at least when I do it with interlocutors, they always then realize what the game is. It's more that they're surprised that, and I know it sounds weird to say it this way, they're surprised that I know what the game is. Because one of the hidden, kind of elements of a racist system is somehow no one's supposed to know that it works that way. But if you can show that you are very aware of the language used in racist discourse, one of the things that surprises a lot of people when I mention it is that I keep up with the Klan and Stormfront and the Aryan Nation and read their publications and their newsletters. And people find that so strange because they, of course, would swear they know no one who ever reads any of these things. And I'm like, oh, but I get them so easily. And so I know what, for example, overt white supremacist groups in the United States are talking about and how they're going to talk about them. And so I can then detect, people begin to get nervous once I bring that up, because then I know your buzzwords, your catchwords, your little phrases that are supposed to sound so neutral, crafted to sound so neutral in these newsletters, where they actually discuss how to neutrally speak racistly. And that throws some people for a loop, because then they realize, oh, some of my passive language use is actually the Aryan nation, infiltrated into what I've heard while I've been playing video games, right? One of the big ways white supremacist movements have tried to connect to this newest generation is through online video gaming. And so when you look at the use of racial language in chats and voice in online gaming, that is not accidental. It's actually deliberate. And this throws people because they begin to realize, oh, if this Black dude is reading Stormfront, on the one hand, they get nervous to think maybe I should too, but the answer is, yeah, you actually should. You should actually be aware of what the truth is in terms of what is being communicated through these channels, particularly if you have children, particularly if they, I know it sounds funny, I'm singling out video games just for the sake of this example, but if you have a son, a white son, between the age of 13 and 18, playing online video games, you need to know that this is the language they are hearing, that they are receiving, that they're going to use to describe the world. It's forming their, what Richard Rorty would call final vocabulary. And so, of course, you should read those, so you know what your kids can hear. Instead of just saying, my children would never hear such things. They do. So that's where denial for me is more in, where if someone would say, oh, my kids aren't hearing this. Now that might be because you don't want to believe that. That's proper denial. But it'd be weird to deny that.
Right.
This discourse.
So there's this issue of passive reception to these very subtle forms of language that further inure us to this recognition. So we have this problem of apathy, of willful ignorance, but also this very subtle form, this very surreptitious form of being informed, so that we become even further insensitive to this systematic nature of these of racism, but perhaps in some way that also opens up this other question that I'm getting here in the chat of this sort of the complexities within the tension of whiteness and blackness, and whether or not those are too crude of tools to enlist to deal with the complexity of something like language use in video games that is that's programmatic on the side of white supremacy, but then becomes a very peculiar form of speech for that individual, and whether or not there's recognition when we're operating within these categories that seem to to act as blanket constructs for a much more localized version or conversation that could take place.
Yeah, but if I could just add, if you step back a bit and look at what I call global racism, it is not given that the discourse is black and white. In fact, I would argue that black and white is a uniquely not American manifestation of racism. I mean, in many countries that I study, for instance, in Latin America, there are grades of race. It doesn't change the harm that racism does. But, you know, if you go to Brazil, for instance, you have the mestizos, you have all kinds of, you know, categorization. And but the bottom line is the pecking order is still the same. You know, it's a ladder in which the lighter, the whiter you are, the better life is for you. If you take another example of another heavily racialized society that has dealt with the pain and trauma of race, South Africa, there are categories called the coloreds, somewhere in between the black and the white. There are the Indians, there are the Asiatics, and all of these categories that came in with the creation of that nation through you know, many years of British colonial rule and apartheid system in that country. So the black and white narrative, you know, represented in the United States as the one-drop rule, it's one version, and I would argue the starkest version of, you know, the racial experience, the racism experience. And this is the irony of it all, that irrespective of the form it takes, the goal is the same. The goal is supremacy and domination. In the United States, the one-drop rule and segregation was aimed at keeping the Black population apart. In a country like Brazil, for instance, the policy from the 18th century was assimilation, but with the same intent to eliminate, to make that Black race vanish, to whiten the population to such an extent that the problem of the Negro ceases to exist. So whether it is by segregation in the United States or by cultural and genocidal assimilation in many parts of Latin America, the end product is the same. At least the intent was the same. So I would caution against thinking that it is the polarization, it is the black and white tension and divide that is the defining ingredient of contemporary racism. Rather, it is a little bit more sophisticated. And I think to address the legacies and the continuing trauma it inflicts of those at the receiving end of the racial society, we need to understand the nuances of how they manifest culturally. And also, if I might add, the resilience of racism. I think Brad really speaks to this, because I was one of those who really believed optimistically that the new generation, among the new generation, there will be a new awakening. I have teenagers myself, and I've always held out the hope that as the new generation comes up, that it's more integrated, you know, more diverse, more acculturated to a different world, a more inclusive world, that the problem of racism will slowly diminish or die. But studies after study have shown that what is happening is not that racism is disappearing, it has become more insidious, less overt. It is mutating. And as anyone who knows, you know, a mutated virus is the most dangerous virus because now you can't identify it. It's happening in the dark worlds of the web. It's happening in video games. It's happening in these spaces where they are not out. And it's now more sophisticated in the way it manifests. And so for me, that is even more worrying, that in some ways, history tells us that overt racism is perhaps even easier to deal with. And I'd like to end with just an example that captures this. So in the history of racism in the United States versus Canada, the dominant narrative was that it was much easier here in Canada. And that is largely true if you think about the Underground Railroad and the fact that there were no Jim Crow-like laws or stiff segregationist laws in Canada as you had in the United States. The first instinct is to say, well, that's true. It was easier for those Blacks living in Canada than in the States. But when you talk to people who actually lived through that period, as I have, and I've spoken to a lot of people who live in Nova Scotia, for instance, the Black community in Nova Scotia, whose history dates back to the 1600s, many of them say that there were more opportunities in the United States because segregation was so bad that you had historically Black colleges. So the typical Nova Scotian, Black Nova Scotian, in the 1960s could not get into Dalhousie University or any other mainstream university, but there was no Black university for them to go because, well, there was no overt racism. So most of them only had opportunities in the historically Black universities in the United States. They had to go to where it was worse to get opportunities to improve their lives because, of course, there was no the Black, historically Black universities here. And here again, you see how racism, in a way, as it becomes, less overt, becomes more insidious. And that worries me, that, we take our eye off the ball when it is not so covert and we assume it's gone. Whereas it is in fact mutating, and we need to develop new awarenesses, new tools to deal with it.
Thank you for those answers. Just attending to the time here and thinking, although certainly this is by no means resolved, perhaps we can move along to the second problem, the second question that we have, and really it is very much related to the first of recognition, and this was mentioned by the both of you, Brad, in this notion of laying claim to a shared history, not playing that game, being honest, and that the problems, as Bonny was saying, of invisibility, denial, apathy, and encountering those in order to lay claim to this shared history and a responsibility for it. So let's say that folks in Europe and her colonies were able to recognize the truth that historical injustices perpetrated on the basis of racial prejudice have systematic implications for the state of societal affairs today, that is something that we could recognize. Imagining this scenario, we can return to Baldwin once again, who I think is instructive. He writes that white folks, quote, do see what they see. And furthermore, what they see is an appallingly oppressive and bloody history, what Bonny was just referring to. Known all over the world, what they see is a disastrous, continuing, present condition which menaces them and for which they bear an inescapable responsibility. This inescapability of responsibility is echoed by Frantz Fanon, who in his book, The Wretched of the Earth, says European civilization and its agents of the highest caliber are responsible for colonial racism. Is this right? Can a whole people, a whole race, bear responsibility for the actions done, institutions created, systems organized by particular others who have long since passed away? How can we understand moral responsibility in either historical or collective terms?
First, in the spirit of Emmanuel Levinas, it begins by realizing that we are all responsible. And so anytime anyone says, I'm not responsible for X, we're already just morally wrong about that, right? Levinas quotes Dostoevsky from Brothers Karamazov, right? I am responsible for everything to everyone, I more than the others. You see that wonderfully repeated in the African-American spiritual. It's me, O Lord, standing in the need of prayer, not my father, not my mother, but it's me, not my brother, not my sister, but it's me, not the stranger or the neighbor, but it's me. And we have to begin with the fact that everyone is responsible. So somewhere in the discussion of race, in America at least, somewhere the responsibility became only one person's responsibility. And so if anyone's read Ta-Nehisi Coates' argument in The Atlantic for reparations, one of the things he reminds the reader is this wouldn't be the government walking into white people's homes and shaking coins out of their pockets. Black people in America receiving reparations would be receiving their own tax dollars back. It's not like Black people don't pay taxes, right? So we have to realize that the collective responsibility actually includes everybody and not just a particular group. And I think it's oddly presumptuous when white people think that only white people will suffer a vengeance, as it were, when it comes to being responsible for the past. It means that Black people also have to have responsibility in the end of racism. So one of those is throwing out incorrect Black narratives. So one of the phrases you hear a lot in, kind of United States, particularly, I don't know if it has made it to Canada, but, in the United States, oh, we're all kings and queens. We're all descendants of kings and queens. No, you weren't. You were not. Stop talking that way. I've talked about honesty of Black portrayal in history. So you see those beautiful paintings and recreations of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. Surely Black people are in the room in Constitutional Hall. Surely Black people are in that room. Now, I don't need to make certain people historically Black in this weird Hamilton spirit that we have now. That includes things like Black Little Mermaid and what have you. I don't know what a Dutch fairy tale has any business doing being represented by Black people. But becoming honest means saying there are slaves in that room. So even Black people in America won't address the slavery of the past. They simply have this kind of white conception of slavery. Let's talk about Black resistance throughout those 400 years. Let's talk about Black heroes, right? We're not simply talking about moral evils or harms done to Black people. As I love to say when I teach Introduction to African American Studies, Black people in America, all in all, if we compare them to the entire rest of the world, turn out quite well. In the world, Black Americans have much to be proud of compared to other, even non-Black populations on the planet Earth. But what we have to address is how much more Black people could have been had their efforts not been stymied at every conceivable moment. And so I think it's very important that Black people do not take the victim narrative. And in America, it's quite common to have, two kinds of racism. Black people in America face two vectors of racism. One is the anti-Black racism that denies Black people their humanity. And we have what in a lot of literature is now called the racism of lowered expectation, where there is this built-in pity for Black people that then counts as excellence things that aren't excellent, or count as victory things that are not victorious. But since it's Black people, they need a lower standard of excellence. And I've always disagreed with that view. So when we talk about taking responsibility, everyone has to take responsibility. And I, as I always joke, I mean responsibility in, dare I say, the most conservative political sense. Everyone is accountable for their actions, their ideas. Everything's at stake in every thought. So when we all claim responsibility, so that, for example, the truth of American history is told. So yes, it does mean acknowledging some slave owners were not brutal, absolutely terrible people. And I can say that without presupposing therefore slavery is okay. No, slavery was wrong. There were people who participated in these wrong actions, but also were morally conflicted about it. We can say that without losing any of the responsibility that now needs to be claimed for that. But what we've decided, particularly in America, is everything's political now. So, this party will hold this view about slavery. That party holds this other view about slavery. And the truth is in neither account. So let's talk about the actual existence of slaves. Let's talk about the consequence of slavery. Why did Jim Crow appear when it did? Why did the prison industrial complex in the United States explode in 1971? Hint, hint, it was not that Black people in America started committing more crimes. what we see in America particularly is a history of trying to prevent Black people from voting. And you can track that hindrance of voting onto Jim Crow, onto the prison industrial complex, which correctly, Michelle Alexander calls the new Jim Crow for that reason, because it's actually about disenfranchising citizenship. The 13th Amendment ended slavery. The 14th Amendment gave Black people citizenship rights in the United States. Had the 14th Amendment never passed, there's no debate, as it were. The problem in America has been, why has there been such an effort to hinder its own citizens? And that's what we have to be responsible for. Not just the whites who in the past passed the legislation, but the whites who keep voting people in the hope that they will legislate. So when people in the United States are actually running in the spirit of Trump with signs that say, make America white again, and someone votes for them, we don't need to care about what happened in the past then. The question is, what are you responsible to now? So whenever we take responsibility, that will be every person. So when I do this stuff in the United States, I ask for immigrants, European immigrants, to talk about how they decided to play along with whiteness in America. Because that whiteness in America was not their previous existence. Whiteness doesn't travel. If you're in England and you so happen to be of English descent, you have a particular skin color, but that's not whiteness. Whiteness isn't your skin color. So when coming to the United States, one had to become white. And I spent a lot of time with immigrants, particularly European immigrants, telling me how they became white in America. And then it's easy for them to say they have no responsibility. I wasn't even here when it happened. Yes, but you knew that America was a racist country, and you came here anyway, and you decided to comply to it. So I often replace the word privilege with complicity, right? No, you complied to it. But then I asked the same question of non-white immigrants. Well, why did you comply to it too? So you all of a sudden now have, the super, Malcolm X inspired non-African Americans who are Black talking about 400 years of oppression. You're from Ethiopia. You're the only country that didn't have a colonial system in place. And you now want to talk about 400 years of oppression. That's equally irresponsible. So maybe instead of responsibility, maybe I should, and I'll shut up about it. We should also talk about irresponsibility, the ways in which we've complied to things without thinking, how we've played along in the game. I find it funny that, as much as Donald Trump represents America, his family has not been in America very long. He's a son of first immigrant parents. His parents immigrated to the United States. My family has been in America longer than Donald Trump's family. How is it that that family is therefore more American than my family? So I have a weird, twisted view. Let's actually count African Americans as original Americans. Put them in with the colonial story. Make them the bad guy in the Native American genocide of the United States, because Black people participated in the genocide against Native Americans. But we won't even grant people whose families have been here for centuries to be American. But anyone who arrives yesterday from Europe is now automatically more American. There's so many problems with that. I won't go into Ralph Waldo Emerson here, but that's important. Responsibility means knowing at every moment how I'm responsible or irresponsible.
Thank you, Brad. Bonny,
Yeah, I just want to briefly follow up with the point about we all bear responsibility. The Canadian Truth and Reconciliation Commission has 94 calls to action. When that commission, headed by Joe Sinclair, finished, its investigation and hearings, it issued 94 calls to action. The 93rd call to action, and I have it on my screen here because I want to read it. It's a short one. It relates to newcomers to Canada. So all the other calls to action deal with various sectors of Canadian society and what they need to do to redress the historical wrong done to Indigenous people, and particularly Aboriginal children who were sent to the residential school. It covers education, the military, health, media, sports, the universities. Every sector of Canadian society has some responsibility. But then it comes to the 93rd, newcomers to Canada. We call upon the federal government in collaboration with National Aboriginal Organization to revise the information kit for newcomers to Canada and its citizenship tests to reflect a more inclusive history of the diverse Aboriginal peoples of Canada, including, and it goes on to name the other calls to action. Well, I came to Canada 30 years ago, and I tell people that for me, this is the most important call to action. Because even as a relative newcomer to Canada, I bear responsibility for the Indian Act. I bear responsibility in some ways for the atrocities committed against Indigenous people, because I'm a beneficiary of what came out of that repression of Indigenous people. And there's a reality to it, as a PhD student in Canada many years ago, I can't tell you how many times I had, newcomers to Canada, students from all over the world making disparaging remarks about Indigenous people, saying, well, if we can come here from these impoverished countries and make all these wonderful things of ourselves, get scholarships, becomes professionals, become academics. What's wrong with Indigenous people? Why are they so lazy? So we were socialized into a system that was repressive. I remember when I took the citizenship test, to become a Canadian citizen about 20 years ago, the section on Indigenous people was 2 lines. And it was the classic narrative of, the Europeans came and they were welcomed by Indigenous people. And so we became complicit. We, as newcomers, became complicit in the narrative of oppression. We became part of the structures of oppression. And so when I hear people saying, oh, I bear no responsibility, I put it down to this deflective approach that we've talked about, because we all bear responsibility. We all bear responsibility because we are beneficiaries of a system of oppression that was created at the expense of particular groups of people. So, and I think that is true. It goes back to the point that's been made about the diffusion of responsibility. And again, I have made this point earlier. When we talk about not bearing responsibility, we aren't really talking about not bearing responsibility for the moral feelings of our society, not the victories. We have absolutely no problems, wearing the toga of honor and victory that comes from the past. Our boys fought in Vimy Ridge. Our boys were victorious in the Second World War. We liberated Europe. That history we're comfortable with. It is the moral feelings of history, of which we are beneficiaries, that we reject. And I think that selective amnesia, it's in itself problematic. And just to add to that, the Canada, of course, has its own history of not bearing responsibility, not just with Indigenous people, but the Black Loyalists, these groups of, Blacks who fought on the side of the British in the Revolutionary War, the American Revolutionary War, promised land and resources in Nova Scotia, never got it. Many of them went back to Liberia and Sierra Leone. A huge population in Nova Scotia, the most repressed Black population in Canada. And these people, it goes back to the point that has been made, are often considered, almost not as Canadian as white people from Europe who immigrated just a few years ago. So when I talk to my friends and colleagues who belong to those communities in Nova Scotia, in Preston, who can trace their ancestry back in Canada to the 1600s, they tell me how offended they are when people ask them, where did you come from originally? So where are you from? I'm from Nova Scotia. And then the inevitable question follows, that I mean originally. And often those who are asking these questions are people who can only trace their ancestry in Canada 2 or 3 generations back. And so in some ways, whiteness invests citizenship in a way that Blackness does not, in a way that even indigeneity does not, which is the irony that you would think that indigeneity is the most authentic marker of citizenship. But such as are the convolutions of racism that even indigeneity does not bestow the kind of citizenship, belonging, and rights that whiteness bestows.
Thank you, Bonnie. So it seems to me from what has been said that perhaps a lot of folks who may not wish to lay claim to this responsibility, who may wish to play the game of active ignorance, may want to say something like, well, I'm not a perpetrator of, say, overt racism. But it seems from what each of you has said that does not mean that we don't perpetuate the system in any variety of ways. So let me just share this quote from Bell Hooks, who in her book, Education for Community, says the following: "Growing up in the world of racial apartheid, I had always known that there were courageous individual white people who sacrificed power, status, and privilege to be anti-racist. I heard their voices as they sat in my grandmother's house on the white side of town and gave voice to their beliefs in justice. I saw them cross the boundaries at a time when they risked life and limb to do so. In my childhood, I knew that white people could change. And yet I knew that most white people did not want to change. That hurt. The knowledge that white people embraced racial domination as their privilege and their right. Racist white people were the norm. The white people who fascinated me, the white people I wanted to know then and now, were the rare white folks who had the courage to choose against racism, to choose and to change." So I know, Brad, you're saying that it's really more an issue of complicity, and saying like it's this issue of, okay, how am I, what is my responsibility, to what am I accountable? And each of us has to lay claim to that as our right, as being citizens of whatever generation that it is incumbent upon us, all of us, to lay claim to this responsibility, this accountability, as both of you have said. But as a question that's coming up in the chat, and also one that I had, is it seems that each of us bears a different responsibility. So what might each of us, depending on where we are situated in this system of racism, what might each of us be responsible for when it comes to dismantling racism? Bonnie, we can start with you.
I can start. So I'm reminded here of Ibram Kendi's how to be a non-racist. What can we do? What actions can you take? I think the first step really is to be open to recognition. That's where we started, and I think that is where the conversation really needs to start. Recognition, acknowledgement. Again, I go back to the Canadian Truth and Reconciliation Commission. One of the issues that came up again and again from Indigenous peoples throughout that process, more than cash compensation or redress or political redress or economic redress, was recognition. Recognition of our pain, of our suffering, and of our trauma, and of our belonging in society. In the case of racism, it has to come from first a willingness to go beyond what has become a barrier to recognition, an acknowledgement that there is a problem. And then we can begin to think about, how do we address this? It is in listening, it is in taking responsibility, and it is being open to some kind of conversations about how to move forward. One of the things that I find, it's central, and that we talk about this very often. What are the markers of good allyship? What should an ally do? You know, what? And I always say that at the end of the day, it's really about allowing for a space where those who have been marginalized, those who have been at the receiving end of what I call the brunt of history, are able to redress themselves, and then actively working to remedy that. What does that mean? There's this interesting saying that the opposite of being racist is not being racist. It's being anti-racist, you know. I think it was, Tanashi Coates who's mentioned, but I found that very profound, that the converse, the opposite of being racist isn't being non-racist, it's being anti-racist. So it's not enough to say, oh, well, I acknowledge and leave it at that. What are you actively doing to remedy the situation within your own space, within your own cultural space, within your own social space? And it requires some sacrifice. This is the part that is often not talked about. It requires giving up something. And I give the analogy of, the bus ride, the riding of the bus. Being a white man in the United States in the 40s and 50s meant you were guaranteed a seat in a crowded bus if there was a black man in that bus. So that was pretty good to live under those circumstances. You walk into a bus, there's a black guy sitting there, he gets up, you get a seat. That's a pretty good way to commute if you had that privilege. And then it changes. And then the civil rights movement changes that whole dynamics. Blacks no longer have to sit at the back of the bus. They no longer have to stand in deference when you walk into the bus. The conditions of life changed. You've given up some privileges. Well, you can deal with it in two ways. You could say, well, this is how it should be. This is the ideal. This is pushing for a more inclusive society. Or you could be deeply resentful because you've lost something, your grandfather had, your father had, and now you were entitled to it. And so I always stress, that anti-racism means making sacrifices, giving up something for a more inclusive society. What I find problematic is the notion that anti-racism should come at no cost. I'm okay with making society more inclusive. I'm anti-racist, I work for it, as long as it doesn't affect what I have come to identify as, things that I'm owed in society. The kind of networks, the kind of privileges that I have historically been entitled to and I've come to expect. Well, I draw the line there. If I have to give up some of this, then there's a problem. So for me, allyship and trying to work towards change goes beyond just an acknowledgement and saying that I'm willing to listen. It's about thinking critically through what will this mean in terms of distributing the resources more equitably. And we see that everywhere, that once the resources are distributed more equitably, those who've been entitled to 3, 4, 5, 6, 10 folds of the resources might get only 2 folds or 3 folds. And while it is still a lot compared to those who've been historically disenfranchised, it creates a sense of loss. And so much of that is what you see in the United States with a backlash, what's been described as the white lash, that things are changing and they're not changing for good. Yet more people are getting into the system, society is getting more inclusive, but somehow I'm losing a lot more than I thought I should, given what generations before me had, as a matter of right. So it is really in how much we're willing to sacrifice, I think, that we can decide whether we are making the right kind of changes.
Thank you for that, Bonny. That really is a nice segue into this question that is quite closely related to it. And I want to address this directly to Brad, so he can weigh in on this this notion of responsibility. And it's really again in relation to in these previous quotes from Baldwin. he repeatedly, there's this repeated refrain that it is white folks in this game that we're playing, this act of denial, this act of ignorance, this apathy. We are the ones who are realizing this lassitude, we are the ones being demonized, even though certainly the historically oppressed, those who are presently oppressed, are the ones who've been marginalized, brutalized, ostracized, demonized, dehumanized. But Baldwin says, white folks are dimly or vividly aware that the history they have fed themselves is mainly a lie, but they do not know how to release themselves from it. And they suffer enormously from the resulting personal incoherence. So in speaking about this responsibility and what responsibility each of us bears, can you say something about that suffering that those who want to engage in this denial and what that looks like, and why bearing responsibility is actually better, or is the best course of action?
Baldwin is actually one of the reasons I never use the word privilege. Baldwin is the one, and I have an article coming out about this soon, but Baldwin always describes white existence as suffering and not as happiness or privilege or power. It's always disempowered. It's always suffering, difficulty. It's hard to be white. So one of my scandalous sentences I use in class to get students going is, the hardest thing to be in the United States is white, straight, and male. It's actually the hardest thing to be. More rules connected to that than being Black. More rules connected to that than being non-male. More rules connected to that than being non-straight. Catherine has it right. You have to fit in the box. And that's the hardest thing. Everything outside the box has more give. Baldwin has the truth. It's easier to be Black than white in America. And in part, it's because Black people are willing to pay the price for it. Because what we don't have is Black people somehow can't figure out how to assimilate into white culture, right? In the United States, that's not the problem. Black people have said no to white culture. And so Black people then have to pay the price for saying no. And a lot of what would happen in the United States would be solved if Black people just said, you know what, okay, we'll buy the white story, we'll do it the white way, we'll name our children, proper English names and things like that. But we're not going to do that. We have no reason to do that. Our liberty says we don't have to do it that way. And so when we see Black people as freer, that's the issue. And I think a lot of white resentment is actually seeing Black people in American context, Latinos, etc. I'll give a quick example, if I may. I was doing a racism conference in Los Angeles a couple of years ago, and we're talking about immigration, which in America, of course, is always a hot button issue when it's not European. There was an old woman from Eastern Europe who got up and began to cry and told her story about how her parents used to whip her for using, and I can't remember what country she was from, but she was using the native language, like on the phone with relatives. And she was whipped by her father. You're in America now. You can't speak that language anymore. You have to learn English, right? So the board game Scrabble got its biggest audience when it was created by immigrants in the United States working on English. The show Password was popular in America because it helped people learn English. What do you do when Latinos now come into the United States, or even Latinos who've been in the United States all along? I live in California. It literally was part of Mexico. They're not giving up Spanish. And then she simply says, and I have to agree with her, why did I give up my native language? That's your resentment. Cheryl Matthias has a great book on this called Feeling White, about the actual emotional trauma of whiteness. And behind every racist white I interview and talk to, because I have no problem with them being racist, so they're gladly racist for me, we get to an emotional tale of trauma and loss, which is so absent from the Black story. The Black story doesn't have that same kind of psychological trauma. And so it's very hard to be white. So I find it funny when people talk about giving things up. White people don't have to give anything up, unless you want to say give up power, in that very ethereal, abstract sense of power. The problem is what people really need is to gain power. White people aren't losing anything. They have things to gain. Black culture in the United States actually created culture, created institutions, created its own way around racism. Black people did answer the oppression. So when we merely talk about Black people in America as if they didn't do anything in response to this, that's a tricky thing. And so when white people say, oh, I'd have to give up. Oh, no, quite to the contrary. Not give up, but gain. And somewhere we claim scarcity. I follow George Bataille. There's no such thing as scarcity. Everything's in excess. That's our problem. Everything's in excess, not in scarcity. So when we look at equality, why are we not letting individual Americans set out the courses for their own lives, instead of the government interfering on behalf of certain people? So really what we are looking at, we talk about institutional racism in America, is that United States government funded things for the benefit of whites and did not include Black people in them. And anytime something could include Black people, the federal government then didn't do it. So the number one reason the United States does not have a unified national health service is because it would benefit everybody, and therefore it cannot be funded by the federal government. When Planned Parenthood began to be funded by the American government, it was because it was interested in decreasing the Black birth rate. Once it's not doing that, the battle against funding begins, when we know that more white women in the United States have abortions than Black women. That's when everyone started attacking Planned Parenthood. So when we come to terms with what we would actually gain by getting rid of racism, in America, that'd be very obvious. You'd have national health. The biggest issue in America is whether you're going to be able to afford to go to the hospital or not, regardless of race. Even poor white people run that risk because they'd rather be racist than have health care. So they're not losing anything. They will gain health care. When they stop being racist, they're not going to lose something. They're going to gain something, maybe like a national education system that actually rewards intelligence. Maybe we create an America that doesn't require everyone to go to college, because what in America that really means is every white person should go to college. Get rid of that racism, and you get rid of some of our complex systems that have made things difficult to be white. Get rid of racism, and white people in Los Angeles County, at least in California, will pay less for their houses than they currently do. Because remember, white people in the United States, this might be very different in Canada, white people in the United States pay more money to be white, pay more money to be in white neighborhoods, pay more money to have a mostly white school system. That's expensive. So let's not talk about what they lose, let's talk about what they gain. Because white people give up a lot to be white. They give up culture, they give up any notion of pride. This is Ashley Jardina's newest book that came out on white identity politics a couple of years ago. She had this survey and was asking a variety of white people who identified as white and thought it was politically important that they were white. Name 5 people that all white people should be proud of. They couldn't name them. No one could come up with 5 names. But then if you said, okay, what was your cultural background? Oh, I was Scottish. Are there 5 Scots that Scottish people should be proud of? Yes, of course. But white Americans have no unified sense of who to be proud of in white America. And meanwhile, every other immigrant, group in the United States and what I would call native groups, Native Americans, Latinos, Blacks. Remember, America never was white, ever, ever. Always a multicultural setup. African Americans can name 5 people that most African Americans would be proud of. And so whiteness gave up identity, gave up any real belongings in the name of this just empty whiteness. As Baldwin himself says, right? Talks about 2 loaves of bread, the unnutritious, gluten-zapped white bread that represents America, when America is actually a multi-grain loaf full of vitamins and minerals and very nourishing to the soul. And for those who are willing to accept that, they receive that nourishment. Those who decide to receive nothing and remain hollow is the heart of our white supremacy. There's no surprise that there's a correlation between, in the United States, and this has been studied, white supremacist beliefs and meth use. A hollowness, not in abundance. So when we're talking about these things, we have to be willing to say, okay, part of how we become anti-racist is literally, I sometimes use the metaphor in class of knocking the chessboard over. It's going to take us to decide that this game is dumb. It's really dumb. And it makes white people's lives terrible. Now, true, it does cause Black lives to be inconvenienced, but Black culture invented things to deal with that. White culture did not. White culture did not build anything to deal with that suffering. And so we got to start really addressing that. The nation needs truth, it needs reconciliation, it even needs therapy so that it can actually move forward.
Thank you so much for that. That is a really nice segue to really Bonny's area of expertise in this restorative justice and that notion of nourishment and promoting inclusion and recognizing that there is nothing to be given up and only things to be gained leads to this question: well, what are the conditions of the possibility of restorative justice with respect to colonial racism? And
question.
just so that we're nearing the end of the session, so I think you might have the last word here.
Yeah, and I'll keep it brief because I think we've transitioned quite nicely from recognition to responsibility, and now we're at restoration and reconciliation. So it is something that a lot of nations, countries, dealing with not just racism, but all manner of historical injustices are now coming to terms with. Of course, many of the people in the audience will be familiar with the Canadian Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And this is one of many attempts to try and deal with the deep histories of racism and move society forward. But I have to say that in all my studies, the one place where I have found the strongest opposition to the TRC model is the United States. Whenever I give a talk about truth and reconciliation in a typical United States university or a conference, I am met with disdain and skepticism by people on both sides, and it's always been something that I've been interested in. Interestingly, Congresswoman Barbara Lee of California, and Brad may know her, has introduced a bill in the US Congress. I think this is also building on Congressman Coyen's bill that's been in Congress for a long time. And it is for a truth commission on slavery. in the United States. Where that bill would go, nobody knows, but it's there. But what I find really interesting is that that bill omits any reference to reconciliation. And it is typical of the kind of conversations I get when I'm in the United States. And I've alluded to this earlier, that there's an aversion to thinking about the process of truth-seeking and reconciliation within one framework. That recognition and acknowledgement has to come first before we can even begin to contemplate any conversation on reconciliation. And this comes, I hear, from both Blacks and whites. And maybe that is best for the United States given its history. Here in Canada, we've opted for a truth and reconciliation model, although for a very specific, historical event. And although a lot of people would say it has its limitations, it hasn't gone far enough, the calls to actions and the recommendations have not all been implemented, but it seems to me that it offers an opportunity, it offers one way that societies can begin to have open conversations. Certainly in a country like South Africa, the Truth Commission model was central to the transition from apartheid to democracy and a more inclusive society, despite its many limitations. It remains a model that I advocate, and it will be interesting to see if the United States at some point finds this model one way to deal with the lingering and deep-seated questions about racism in that country.
Thank you for that. Brad, did you want to just weigh in on this very, very quickly, or?
I'm sure Bonny has heard this response since he's heard it from Americans on both sides. I think some of the difficulty in the United States compared to South Africa is we're not, although the 2040 sociological deadline for the end of white majority in the United States is looming, it was easy to do truth and reconciliation in South Africa because it really was mostly about Black people telling their story with so few white people. Whereas in America, you have a white identity politic that can always vote that down. There's too many white people for South Africa's kind of Truth and Commission to work in America. Or you get the other side of that on the Black argument, which is, well, Black people are more than ready just to forgive white people. Black people are actually in America, we're good church folk. We're the most Christian people in the United States when you look at the actual ethnographic data. And, we will forgive. We've even seen examples of this when white police officers shoot Black people, and then the family of the Black man shot in his own home by a drunk white female police officer goes over and hugs her, and then the judge, Black judge, gets off the bench and hugs her because they had to find her guilty, and we're just sorry, but that's just the way justice has to be. What Black people in America probably want more is the truth part. But the white part of America doesn't want the truth part. White people will gladly let Black people forgive them, but they don't want to know that they're in need of forgiveness. And that's going to be the problem there. And so, at least the South African model seemed more one-sided. It was a way for Black people in the majority to reclaim themselves as South Africans. Black people in America have already claimed themselves as Americans in a particular way. It's just this population that doesn't want Black people to make that claim. So it's a little different, but I'm sure you've heard that response before.
Okay, well, I'm just going to, we'll end it there. Thank you both so much, Brad and Bonny, for giving of your time and your insights into this incredibly complex, but incredibly significant and meaningful topic that affects us all. So I want to say thank you to the both of you. Thank you to the philosophy department here at McMaster University, to the Alumni Association, and to the McMaster Continuing Education, who all have fostered this philosophy talk. So I wish you all good night, and keep the conversation going.